Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. This podcast is sponsored by Collins, high quality student books, teacher guides and unbeatable value revision for GCSE and A-level sociology. Now, Sociology Show listeners can get 25% off Collins sociology resources until the end of December 2021. And that includes a new book, How to Be a Sociologist, an inspiring introduction to studying sociology at A-level and university. If you'd like to take up this offer, simply head to collins.co.uk/sociology and enter the code Sociology Show at the checkout. Terms and conditions apply, but that offer does run all the way up till December 2021. The Sociology Show podcast is also brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is at tutor2u.net/sociology. And once you're on there, you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And in this episode, we are speaking to Professor Diane Reay. Now, many of you may not have heard this episode before. If you have heard it before, it's well worth a re-listen. But I've had plenty of requests of people asking me to speak to Diane. I was lucky enough to actually speak to her some time ago, so I thought I'd re-release the episode, particularly for those of you that are starting sociology for the first time. Maybe you've just started a GCSE or an A-level or maybe your degree and you haven't heard this episode. One of my favourites, one of the most passionate speakers that I've ever spoken to. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview with Professor Diane Reay. My guest for this episode was Diane Reay from the University of Cambridge. Every so often, I ask people who they'd like to have on the show. Diane is one of the most requested sociologists, and so I was absolutely delighted to be able to talk to Diane. The main thing that I wanted to talk to her about was her book, Miseducation, Inequality, Education in the Working Classes, which came out in 2017. If you're unaware of Diane's work, please do look it up. And in particular, I was really interested in her passionate discussion at the end in terms of what needs to happen in education if we want to move somewhere towards equality. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Diane Reay. I'm a sociologist and a feminist academic from a working class background.
Thank you, Diane. And actually, talking about your background, I thought it would be interesting to start by talking about that, your upbringing, your early childhood, and your life before doing what you're doing now.
Yeah, well, I think I've written quite a lot about background. Yeah. I come from a socialist trade union working class background. I grew up in the South Derbyshire coalfields, and that's had a big impact, I think, on the sort of sociology I do and my motivations for doing it. I have, it's very interesting, I think, because I've thought a lot about this. I've got very, very vivid memories of my schooling. And the negative aspects of it. There's not many things I can remember that I felt a sense of accomplishment or joy or positive vibes. It was very much, it was part of a class struggle. And I think that I had a really difficult, stressful, anxiety-inducing time throughout my schooling. I was always had a sense that I didn't really belong and that I was getting things wrong. And I think that made me the person I am. But it's also the reason why I'm so obsessed with education. and issues around educational identity, but also educational achievement, social mobility, working class failure, and also middle and upper class educational success.
And so it's quite surprising that you have gone this far in education if you perhaps didn't like it yourself to start with then. Well,
I think there's always been a stigmatizing of the working classes in education. I mean, I think my experience exemplifies that. At the moment I got into school, I was put in the bottom set in the expectation that I was, not a very clever child who wouldn't be able to cope with reading. And I had to fight to get out of that set. And that is a conflict in itself, because in struggling to be recognised as someone who can succeed at education, you are actually leaving behind your working class peers. And that's always been a tension for me. And I think that comes out in my work, the tension between achieving educational success as a working class individual and what that means in terms of who and what you have to leave behind.
Yeah, and you were one of 8, is that right, siblings?
Yeah. I was the oldest, and I think that was interesting as well, because I think when I started to actually do well, my mother decided that she didn't want the other children to be educational successes. She recognised once I'd gone to university that it meant leaving her behind, becoming a very different person to the person she was. And my mother and I were very close, and I think that was a very painful psychological rift for both of us. But what she did as a result of that was no longer encourage my younger siblings to do well at school. And most of them left school when they were 15, 16.
So what gave you the drive, Diane, then? Because you said it was difficult not just from a class background, but for a female as well at the time. I imagine that was quite a struggle too.
Well, this is why I like Bourdieu so much. I think I use habitus a lot, and I think habitus is about embodied dispositions. It's about the past in the present, embodied history. And I think that I wasn't just struggling in school to do well for myself. It was about my parents' lack of recognition, my grandparents' lack of recognition, the fact that they felt shame and a sort of silencing through not being recognised in their own schooling. That became a very powerful, incredible drive for me. I work out the consequences.
Yeah. And so I take it you were the first to go to university, but were you the first to go into any kind of further education at all then?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. My dad left school when he was about 13. My mum left school when she was 16.
And what about sociology as a subject? When did you first encounter that?
Well, that was sort of serendipity in some ways, because my family were quite political. They were always strong Labour supporters. My dad, when I started to do well at school, would talk to me about becoming a Labour MP. And I think we both thought that might be possible. We didn't realise that working class women didn't become any sort of MP for any political party at that time. But I went to university to read politics and economics, and I had a bad experience of being sexually harassed by a member of staff. And so I moved across and did a different subject as a result of that. So I think it wasn't something that I'd intended to do. But the thing was, actually, my whole university experience was no better than my schooling. I wasn't socially acceptable. I was lower working class female when really lower working class females didn't go to university. I think when I went, only 8% of the age cohort went on to university, and they were nearly all middle and upper class. So when I went to Newcastle, there were a few working class boys, but there was nobody like me. And I didn't have any women friends who were other students. My women friends were from the town. And I did have some male friends, but that was more to do with heterosexuality, really, than friendship. And so I left university feeling, well, firstly, I got very ill. I became anorexic, and then I became bulimic, and really had a lot of psychological distress. So by the time I'd finished taking my final exams, I decided I didn't want anything to do with the middle classes anymore, and certainly not the upper classes. And so I persuaded someone at the local teacher training college, which was for mature students, to take me on, even though I was only 21. And I became a primary school teacher, which ironically is what my head teacher told me I should have been all along. Mm-hmm. She discouraged me from applying to university because she said it wasn't for girls like me. And on one level, she was right.
And it's amazing, the kind of what you faced as a working class female, even being called like scum, you mentioned in one of your books.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting. They had a freshers week in the first week, and I went to, it was like a formal ball, and I got my short Bieber dress on, which wasn't quite right. And some public school boys who were doing economics came across and asked if they'd seen me that day earlier on in Woolworths. And the reference they were making was that, I must be a local shop girl. I couldn't be a student.
Yeah.
And I think there was, there were lots of painful things about having to deal with class contempt and ignorance.
Well, I have to say that I absolutely admire your perseverance, particularly for someone that didn't enjoy large aspects of her education, certainly.
Well, I dropped out, and then I did something that actually I really liked doing, which was I became a primary school teacher, a reception class teacher in the ILEA, and I did that for 20 years.
Yeah. And when you were studying sociology, you already mentioned you were influenced by Pierre Bourdieu. Was there anyone else that was of great influence to you? Who else did you enjoy reading?
Well, Jackson and Marsden, Education in the Working Class, had a really mega impact on me when I first read it. And that's why I revisited that in the book I wrote, Miseducation, because I was 18 at the time, and I just thought, this makes total sense to me, even though the working classes they were writing about were from a very different fraction of the working classes to my own. So that book was really seminal. But there's another book that reduced me to tears when I read it. I found it really powerful, which is Valerie Walkerdine and Helen Lucy, Democracy in the Kitchen, which contrasts working class and middle class mothers and their mothering of young children, preschool age children. And I found that really powerful. And what I did find particularly evocative was that they had an introduction which talked about their own experiences as working class young women. And that was the first time I thought, actually, you can write about yourself.
Yeah.
It doesn't all have to be heavily theorized. You can actually use your own experiences to illuminate some of the theory, some of the themes.
Yeah, and that, you mentioned your own book, Miseducation, which is what I'd like to talk to you most about today. And that is one of the things that strikes me about that book, just how accessible it is. Many pieces of academic writing are so high level, dare I even say dull at some point, but your book is really accessible. It reads as a personal experience and a memoir as much as anything else.
But I mean, and this is a bit of a confession, really. I don't know whether I should say this, but the other thing that really sort of stunned me when I read it was Basil Bernstein.
Ah, yes, yeah.
And he writes about restricted and elaborated codes. And I thought, and this is how you never lose that deficit view of yourself, I thought, this is me. I am a woman of restricted code. I haven't got this extensive, elaborate vocabulary. I mean, at university, people were always correcting. They were correcting my use of words, they were correcting my grammar, they were correcting my pronunciation. I mean, someone told me I was Miss Malaprop, and I didn't even know what a malapropism was at the time. And so that was quite powerful. But I mean, what I felt about Bourdieu, and always have felt, is that he's not condescending. He doesn't judge the working classes. And I think other social theorists sometimes seem to be buying into deficit versions. And Bernstein tended to do that a bit in my reading of him. I mean, the other two people, because I mean, one is R.H. Tawney, who's not really a sociologist. He's a socialist philosopher, really, educational philosopher. And I love his work on equality. And the other person is Lynn Layton, who's a psychotherapist, but also an academic at Harvard. And that's what I have learned, is that I think sociological imagination needs insights from a wide range of disciplines. That actually, you know, I'm first and foremost a sociologist, but I've learned so much from looking at psychology, history, politics.
If you're happy to, I'd like to go into a little bit more detail about your book, Miseducation, Inequality, Education and the Working Classes. So that's 2017, so 3 years old now, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
But looking at the reference in it, it's actually, you know, the data is collected over a huge period of time, isn't it? From some of the early interviews up to the more recent.
I mean, I learned something else as a female sociologist from a working class background, is that your work can so often be discounted, particularly if, like me, you do largely qualitative work. What I love doing is talking to people. Yeah. Going and listening to their stories. But I mean, that has had repercussions for how your work's received. So the work that Helen, Lucy and I did, which actually involved a sample of 450 children, was discounted as, you know, small scale qualitative research, even though we were trying to say quite significant things about how working class children were treated in school. And the same happened when I accused Cambridge of being institutionally racist. Yeah. They said that my research didn't count because it was small scale and qualitative. But so what I tried to do in Miseducation was do masses of research, look at all the surveys, look at all the quantitative research, look at all the studies, the reports, go back historically, look at, I went back to Hansard, looked at a lot of the education subcommittee reports going back decades. And I just felt that although the young people I've talked to tell wonderful stories and are really insightful about their educational experiences, that had to be supported by some stats and some facts, because I didn't want what I was saying to be discounted, because I think it was too important for me to be told yet again. It was just another few stories.
Yeah, I think that's what stands up really well, because it's kind of got the empathetic interviews with the real life stories, but backed up by the data as well, and also the history of the UK education system throughout the last 50, 60 years as well.
Yes. Not a happy story. Well, not if you're working class.
No, but I've just found some of the stories. I mean, there was one lady, I think you called her Josie.
Yeah.
Stuck in my mind because that's my mum's name as well. But you were in contact with her for over 20 years.
Yeah, and still am. Not very often at the moment because you can't see anyone because of COVID, but yes.
So if you don't mind describing a few of those stories. So I think in chapters 3 and 4 is where you talk to individuals about their experiences. Which kind of working class experiences really stand out in your mind and are kind of indicative of what many experiences for the working classes?
A lot of these stories have made me cry. I mean, when I interviewed Sean, I think it was the last time in secondary school, about his desperate attempt to stay on top of things and feel that he was a good learner. But I think I found it particularly evocative how children talked about being tested, the SATs and testing and being assessed. And I mean, I was shocked when young children said, you know, well, that means that I'm going to grow up and not be a very good person. And this is a literacy numeracy test aged 9, 10. And it seemed to have such incredibly powerful implications for how they saw themselves and felt about themselves. And the shocking thing is that we have an incredibly hyper-competitive educational system when all the evidence shows that children not only feel much better about themselves, but actually do a lot better if they're working collaboratively, collegially, in groups. So, I mean, I think that was very powerful, the fact that they could speak so eloquently about the impact of testing and assessment. But the other really saddening theme was the one around how working class children felt about being in bottom sets. And we routinely do that to them. You know, there's been a real move towards more and more setting and streaming. It's very different when I was teaching in the ILEA. Then there was no setting and streaming in primary schools, and not very much actually at secondary level. But now it's just the expectation that we group children according to what we see as their ability, and then expect it not to have a detrimental impact on how they feel about themselves as not just learners, but more widely.
Yeah, I spoke to Professor Louise Archer, who's done a lot of extensive research into that, and she found there's absolutely no proof that setting and streaming has any positive effects, perhaps for a small minority at the very top, in the top set.
Yeah, and that's the same as there's the research on collaboration and cooperation. It's shown to really enhance not just well-being, but attainment. And yet, we focus on the competition, which is about producing a whole host of losers so a few children can be the winners.
Yes, exactly. I think your research also shows that England tests more than anyone, doesn't it, across Europe?
Yes, yes.
So is that just a reflection of, like you said, capitalist neoliberalism? We're just setting kids up to compete against each other and ultimately for failure.
I think so. And it's because we've moved, miles away from a view of education as an end in itself to a view of education as a means of economic ends. So it's education in the service of the economy. And there you're supposed to make workers tough, mean, motivated and competitive.
Yeah, I noticed, I watched one of your YouTube clips as well, and you were saying, but evidence shows, let's take something like the Finnish system, that students working together and non-competitive and less testing is actually far more effective. So why don't we adopt it?
Because I've thought about this a lot. I mean, our political elite are not interested. I don't think they're really interested in educating the working classes. There's masses of rhetoric, and after COVID and the current pandemic, there's been a lot of talk about protecting the vulnerable and the poor and ensuring that there's not an educational achievement gap. But actually, we've never been really, we've talked, the rhetoric's all been about bridging and shortening that educational achievement gap. But then none of the policies that are implemented are going to really touch it. The things that would make a difference, which are extra resources, more teachers in disadvantaged schools, have never been broached. So, I mean, I think it's, I think that, as I say in the book, in the history section, education for the working classes has always been about control and containment, factory fodder, and maybe now service sector fodder. But it's not really been about a desire to educate, empower, enrich, realise potential.
Did it improve at all under New Labour, though? Is that a bit of a misconception? Was there any improvement?
It did. I mean, I think things got better, but they didn't really get anything like as much improvement as we need to have just a fair educational system. I mean, I'd be happy with that.
Yes. And I know you have also, at the other end, perhaps, abolition of the private school system. Does that need to happen?
Yeah, no. I think that would be a really good starting point. But I don't think we're going to get that either. But I think that it's very interesting because when you look at what's going on in quite a lot of private schools at the moment, they've actually got the collaboration, the cooperation, the teamwork, the lack of streaming and setting. And we've moved more in the direction that private schools were working in sort of about 50 years ago. Yeah. So we've gone back to a model of private schools, which is very outdated in the past. And they've moved on. And they're supposedly preparing their students for a very complex and unpredictable labour market, which is certainly what we should be doing in the state sector as well. I mean, I don't know if you saw the OECD research, which looked at, I think there were 27 different countries, and they looked at the schools the countries that had the most repetition, routine learning, memorization. And we were actually top of that. And then they looked at the countries that had the most critical thinking skills, creativity, intrinsic motivation, and deep learning. And we were at the bottom, just above Uruguay.
Yeah. So we're squashing creativity as well.
Well, I don't think there's any space for critical thinking skills and creativity. And what I tried to bring out in the book, Miseducation, was that actually there's now within the state sector a different education for the working classes than from the middle classes. That working class schools have a narrow curriculum because there's more pressure on them to increase their SATs results, their test results. There's more teaching to the test. They've got the least experienced teachers, less resources, and a greater turnover of staff as well. Mm. So they're experiencing a very different educational system within English state schooling.
And I was also interested what you said, what seems to be happening with state schools, they themselves are becoming segregated. So you get whole state schools that are white and middle class and whole state schools that are 90% ethnic minority and poor.
Yeah. No, I think that's... And when we did a research project on the white middle classes sending their children to ethnically diverse inner city comprehensives. And the first 9 comprehensives that we approached laughed and said, we don't have any white middle class children. And I think there's a degree of segregation and polarization which is not fully recognized, and without being recognized, there's no way it's going to be dealt with, but it's a real problem. And it's because of yet again, that neoliberal focus on choice. And choice is, there's only choice for people with the resources. So I've always said, the working classes end up with the choices the middle classes don't want to make. Yeah. And the middle classes are increasingly choosing not to send their children to schools where there's too many working classes or too many Black, Asian, ethnic minority children.
Thank you, Diane. That's going to be the end of part 1. In part 2, we'll talk more about your research in the book Miseducation. Hi, welcome back to part 2 of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Diane Reay. Diane, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about your book. It's interesting you're talking about how education has changed. What kind of challenges do you think a working class student today faces that perhaps they didn't in the past?
Well, I think probably more than when I was growing up. And that's really scary, I think, because I found it quite tough dealing with education as a young working class girl. But I think the view of the white working classes has particularly changed. That there's a sense, because of the neoliberal focus on social mobility and meritocracy, that if you remain working class, you've not tried hard enough, made enough efforts, that actually you're undeserving, that actually the good working classes are the ones who pick themselves up by their bootstraps, work really hard and make themselves middle class. And I think there's quite deficit views of the working classes in English society. And I know that's shifted a little bit under the pandemic, because now there's a sense that, a lot of these people are key workers and they've not been recognised, and we need to clap for them. Yeah. But I'm slightly worried that that's just a short-term superficial veneer over actually quite embedded strong views, particularly among our political elite, that the working classes don't deserve any more than they get.
You mentioned the white working classes there, because I think at one point in the book you mentioned that some FSM, free school meal pupils from other backgrounds, do actually succeed or do better than the white FSM group. So what do you think is happening there?
I think there's a number of things. I think the white working classes have experienced English state education over many generations. They've become inured to decades of, maybe even centuries of being written off, of not being seen to have any educational potential. And there's parents and grandparents who have very negative experiences of schooling. I think that some of our BAME groups are coming, that their parents or grandparents have come from countries where they've had some educational success. So they have family networks with professionals in them. It was very interesting for me. I mean, I did some research in a school on gifted and talented, which is now very much an old scheme. But the only boys who could cope with the label of gifted and talented in this predominantly working class school were two black working class boys, because they got, well, one was from Africa, his uncles were professionals in Nigeria, and he had a sense that educational success and a professional job was something that he could aim for. I don't think that the white working classes have those networks or that sense that it might be something they can aim for. I think that you have to differentiate though and distinguish between different groups, because black British groups have also now had generations who've experienced educational failure. And so they're not perhaps doing as well as black African or Indian or Chinese groups here. I think it's very interesting. I think you need to look at the migration histories and what happened to their earlier generations, their families in the countries that they've come from. Because I think that makes a difference to whether they have a sense that they're entitled to do well at school and to get a good job.
Yeah, so it sort of drifts more into the kind of cultural capital and family background more than the economic.
I think the cultural and the social capital are really, really important. And I think that they can powerfully compensate for economic capital, because it's quite obvious that that most BAME groups in society are poor and getting poorer relatively, but some of those groups do still manage to do well educationally.
And is it fair to say as well, we're particularly talking about boys within those groups, white working class boys and black working class boys?
I think there's obviously a gender difference. I think I always find it very difficult. I mean, I do try always to talk about the way in which race is classed and class is raced, because I think there's actually some playing off, that sometimes the white working classes are sort of singled out as a group who need our particular attention and focus. And within that, it's white working class boys. And then other times, BAME groups are used to as an invidious comparison to make the statement that the white working classes aren't doing as well as they should. But I think that although girls generally do better than boys, I think there's a lot of concern about black British girls who are underachieving. And I read some research recently that showed that black British middle class girls are not doing as well as their counterparts. And I think, we have to recognise that what all BAME groups are dealing with is institutional racism. Yeah, although that's often denied. Politicians.
And I was just thinking, to reverse the argument a little bit more, I know in chapter 5 of the book you talk about those from the working classes that do actually go on to succeed educationally. What is the recipe, if you like, for those students that do actually become socially mobile?
Oh, wow. I think it's deeply problematic, because I've done some recent research looking at working class students at elite universities. And I collaborated with a Chinese colleague who has looked at elite universities in China as well. And what those students do is invest so heavily in acquiring academic cultural capital that they lose out on the social networks. And I think that research both here and in America is showing that social capital is probably just as important as cultural capital in acquiring a good professional job. And I think that on one level, working class students are you have to work so hard. You know, you're sort of struggling against the odds, that they spend so much time investing in the actual academic work that they often don't invest in the social networks. But then at the same time, they're often excluded from those social networks, particularly if they go to somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge, where you just can't get into those, I mean, Boris Johnson isn't going to let any riffraff into the Bullingdon Club, is he? But I think that what we're learning is that social capital is actually more important than, the value we've given it.
The reason I asked that question, Diane, is many people would point to yourself as an example that actually you can be working class and be socially mobile.
Well, yes, but I think you become a different person. That's why I always say academic from a working class background, because I can't call myself middle class. My values, my loyalties, my emotional attachments aren't to the middle classes. But I can't call myself working class because that would be a denial of my privilege. So I think I've talked about in the past, you're sort of on a hinterland. You don't really belong in that space, but you don't really belong in the place you've come from. I was very lucky. I mean, I got a job at Cambridge and became a professor at Cambridge. And there were lovely people there, but I was never one of them. And what you have to deal with is someone who's socially mobile, especially who's someone socially mobile over a huge social distance, is that you never have a sense of really belonging anywhere. I mean, I think things have changed for me because I've now been able to get back to my social political activism. And I do have a sense of belonging among the group of left-wing activists that I work with. But we're a very mixed hybrid group from all different backgrounds, classes, ethnicities. But certainly in the academic field, I think it's quite difficult to feel you're really one of them. You always have a sense that someone's going to find you out, discover that, you don't really have the right to be there.
I spoke to both Dr. Lisa McKenzie and Dr. Jenny Thatcher, who both said exactly the same thing. They're never completely comfortable with their position and their place, yeah. And I thought that was interesting. You just reminded me that you mentioned at the start of your book, actually, the number of people that are, by definition, ostensibly middle class, but still refer to themselves as working class. There's quite an overwhelming number of people that do that in the UK, don't they?
And I think a majority of those people are actually working class by birth.
Yeah.
They've been socially mobile into the middle classes. And I think that indicates that they don't quite know where they belong. If you're a professor or a lawyer or an accountant and you're still saying you're working class, then that shows me that you working out quite where you belong and who you are has become problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, I know you reference Mike Savage's work on the different scales, the social class scale.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are slightly confused as to where they sit on that scale.
Yeah. The problem is, I think, that so many people are stuck. They're stuck in their class position without the resources to move or the opportunities to realise their potential.
Yeah, yeah. Could I give you one last question, Diane?
Yeah, of course.
I heard a very inspiring speech that you made on one of the clips on YouTube about what you think needs to happen in education to try and achieve more equality. Could you give us kind of like your 3-point plan, if you like? What do you think needs to happen to get somewhere nearer towards equality at least?
Well, we need to ensure we've got much more of a level playing field. So I'd get rid of private schools. I'd get rid of all the different sorts of schools within the state sector, which have become a really invidious hierarchy, academies, free schools, middle class comprehensives, working class comprehensives. And I'd want common schools that all children in the locality attended. But it's difficult as a sociologist to just talk about education. Yeah. All right, so maybe I'll start with what I'd do first. I'd have radical redistribution. So I'd ensure that the gap between the rich and the poor was a tenth of what it is now. I'd want to seriously tax the rich, get rid of tax avoidance, and pull up all those people in poverty. It's shocking that we live in a wealthy country and we have so many people living in poverty. And that's going to absolutely accelerate with the result of the pandemic and the economic recession we're going into. I'd ensure that the income and wealth distribution in our society was like it is in the Nordic countries, which is much, much fairer. And then we've got a fighting chance of having a fair and socially just educational system. So I'd have common schools like they've got in Finland. I'd get rid of all the testing and exams until children were 16. I'd have a totally different pedagogy. I think Bell Hooks talks about a pedagogy of optimism, or anyway, what she talks about is that, the best way to learn for all ages of learners is collaboratively problem solving. So I'd have that focus again on critical thinking skills, creativity, deep learning, and I would get rid of this individualized competition. One of the most shocking things I heard last year, I went into primary schools, into year 1, and a little girl said to me, she said, "You can't help your friend in the class anymore, because if you help your friend, that's a form of cheating." And I think this idea that, we've got to sort of have very individualized approaches to learning is all wrong. We learn much better as a group, collectively. So I'd want a totally different pedagogy. I'd want a totally different curriculum. I want a curriculum that, all right, definitely decolonizing. I'm all with the students at Oxford and Cambridge, but I'd want it in schools as well. Yeah. Black History Week, Black History Month, that's not good enough. Black history should suffuse the whole curriculum, and so should working class history. And so there should be a much more open, receptive curriculum that recognises all cultural, social groups in society.
Totally agree.
I would be wonderful. I'd be so excited about getting involved in doing this.
Well, also, I think teachers would enjoy that a lot more. And also, one of the most depressing things I saw on one of your talks is that I think England's bottom in terms of happiness and enjoyment levels at school as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the problem. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that supposedly, the responsibility and decision-making have been devolved to schools. But teachers have got no autonomy, no power in deciding how they teach, what they teach, how they do it. It must be so depressing as a teacher, because, what about their creativity and critical thinking skills? They can't mobilise them.
I agree. Diane, can you take over from Boris for us?
Yeah, well, as I say, I started off wanting to be an MP, but they didn't have people like me. I mean, that's another shocking thing. I don't know if you know that less than 10% of Labour MPs are from working class backgrounds. For the Tories, I think it's less than 4%.
Yeah, that was at the beginning of your book, actually, wasn't it? And that's come down quite a long way from the 60s and 70s, hasn't it?
Yes. I mean, some things have got worse, but we've got to have some things getting better from now on.
Thank you, Diane. And I really enjoyed that last part as well, the little speech. I hope that's got quite a few listeners riled up and behind your ideas, certainly.
There's lots of my stuff to download on academia.edu and ResearchGate. Excellent. I put stuff up there for people to read.
Excellent. And where can people get the book if they haven't read it yet?
should I say they can get it on Amazon?
I know. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether to say that, but yeah.
It's actually cheaper from Amazon, I think, than from the publisher. I did have a no Amazon rule, but with lockdown, I'm afraid I've broken it.
That's understandable. And thank you very much for your time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.